Imagine for a second that you basically shape the cultural and economic DNA of modern Western society.
Right.
You lay the psychological groundwork for capitalism. You influence the daily lives and beliefs of literally millions of people across centuries.
It's a massive legacy.
Exactly. But despite all of this monumental, world-altering influence, you are so utterly terrified of becoming an idol that you demand on your deathbed to be buried in an unmarked grave.
Yeah, it's a profound contradiction, and it perfectly encapsulates the man we're looking at today.
The human heart is a perpetual idol factory. That was his most famous quote. Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a stack of historical sources to uncover the real human story behind that quote, and the man who said it, John Calvin.
Which is such an important story to unpack.
It really is. Our mission today is to move past those, dry textbook summaries you might remember from history class. We want to explore the real turning points, the bitter conflicts, and the massive legacy of a guy who was often fundamentally misunderstood.
Well, what's fascinating here is that John Calvin wasn't just a theologian sitting in some ivory tower dispensing doctrine.
Right.
He was a humanist lawyer by training. He was a fugitive on the run for his life, and in many ways, he was an accidental revolutionary who ended up defining the entire Reformed tradition.
Yeah, and to really grasp his legacy, we have to look at how his ideas built institutions and, wired the modern psyche. And we're doing this entirely independent of whether you or I personally agree with his religious or political views.
Absolutely. We're just taking apart the mechanics of history here.
So to understand how he got to that point, we have to look at the track he was originally placed on. Born Johann Calvin in Noyon, France in 1509.
Right. And his father, Gerard, was a notary for the ecclesiastical court.
Yeah, and he was determined to set his son up for this prominent, comfortable life within the Roman Catholic Church. And this kid was incredibly precocious.
Oh, for sure.
He was employed by the local bishop as a clerk by the age of 12. And he even received the tonsure, which is that specific shaved haircut, symbolizing a lifelong dedication to the church.
The path was completely laid out for him. Through some influential local patrons, Calvin was actually sent to study in Paris, absorbing Latin from the greatest teachers of the era.
He was basically being groomed for the priesthood.
Exactly. But then his father abruptly pulls the plug on the entire plan.
Which is the first major pivot of his life. After years of preparing for the priesthood, his dad suddenly sends him to the University of Orleans to study law.
And the reasoning is painfully practical.
It really is. His dad realized lawyers simply made more money than priests.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a modern parent looking at their kid who has been prepping for med school their whole life and saying, actually, go into corporate law, the paycheck is way better.
Yeah, and that pragmatic shift completely altered his intellectual trajectory.
How so?
Well, it was during this time studying law in Orleans and Bourges that Calvin was exposed to humanism.
And we should clarify, humanism in the 16th century wasn't, secular humanism as we think of it today.
Right. It was an intellectual movement focused on ad fontes, which means going back to the original sources. Calvin spent 18 months obsessively learning Greek.
So instead of just accepting the Latin translations of the Bible that the Catholic Church had used for centuries, he was acquiring the tools to read the original texts for himself.
Exactly. He is combining the rigorous, logical, analytical skills of a lawyer with the linguistic tools to dissect the foundation of the Christian faith.
Wow.
And that combination is what sets the stage for his radicalization.
Yeah, though the sources differ a bit on how that radicalization actually felt. Calvin himself described it in two different ways.
You did, yeah.
In one account, he talks about a sudden event where God subdued his mind. But in another, he describes a long, agonizing process of inner turmoil, groans, and tears.
But the historical catalyst, the moment his life officially blows up, happens in 1533.
Right. His close friend, Nicholas Comte.
Yes. Nicholas Comte delivers an inaugural address at the university in Paris, publicly demanding reform and renewal within the Catholic Church.
And the conservative faculty completely erupts.
Oh, they denounce the speech as heretical immediately. Comte is forced to flee the city just to save his life.
And Calvin, as his known associate, is instantly implicated. He goes from being a promising, comfortable humanist lawyer to a fugitive literally overnight.
Yeah, he spends the next year in hiding, constantly moving around.
And then in 1534, the situation in France boils over with the affair of the placards.
Which was incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, unknown reformers plastered anti-Catholic posters all over French cities, including, apparently, on the king's bedchamber door.
Which is a bold move.
Insanely bold.
Yeah.
The backlash is violent and deadly. French Protestants are burned at the stake. Calvin realizes his home country is a death trap, so he flees entirely. He crosses the border to become a refugee in Basel, Switzerland.
And it's there, in hiding, that he writes the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is published in 1536.
And he was only 27 years old.
Right.
Writing a foundational theological text at 27 while on the run implies a level of obsessive focus that is almost hard to process.
Well, it was born out of crisis. The Institutes wasn't just an academic exercise. It was an urgent defense of his faith.
Right.
He wanted to prove to the French king that the Protestants being executed weren't these dangerous political rebels, but faithful Christians.
And what made the book so revolutionary was its clarity, right?
Exactly. Before Calvin, the Reformation was this messy collection of pamphlets and fiery speeches. Calvin brought the mind of a lawyer to all that chaos.
So he organized the scattered ideas of Protestantism into a clear, cohesive, systematic worldview.
He did, and it becomes a massive hit in reform circles. He's suddenly a known quantity.
So he decides to head to Strasbourg, which was a free imperial city. He's hoping to just live a quiet life as a scholar.
But because of military maneuvers blocking the road, he has to take a detour south through the city of Geneva.
And he plans to stay in Geneva for exactly one night.
A single night that literally changes the course of European history.
Wait, I have to ask. If he was just passing through, how does a one-night stay turn into his entire legacy? If his whole goal was to reach Strasbourg and disappear into a library, what compelled this stubborn, brilliant lawyer to give up his dream?
It was the sheer psychological force of a man named William Farel.
Okay.
Farel was this fiery, passionate local reformer who had already started trying to turn Geneva Protestant.
Right.
He hears that the brilliant young author of the Institutes is staying at a local inn for the night, so Farel tracks Calvin down and essentially corners him. He begs Calvin to stay and help lead the city's reformation.
And Calvin initially says no, right? Because he just wants to study.
He absolutely refuses. So Farel resorts to what is essentially theological blackmail.
Wow.
He unleashes this thunderous curse, telling Calvin that if he refuses to stay and help in this time of desperate need, God will curse his quiet studies and his precious leisure.
That is intense.
Yeah.
And for a man like Calvin, who was, profoundly fearful of disobeying God, that threat struck him like a lightning bolt.
Yeah, he felt as though God himself had violently intervened. So he yields.
He stays. But their first attempt at reforming Geneva is a spectacular failure. I mean, they completely crash and burn.
They really did. They fell into the classic trap of trying to change too much too fast.
Right.
Farel and Calvin drafted these comprehensive articles on how the church should be organized. They wanted to enforce strict moral discipline and require every single citizen to subscribe to a new confession of faith.
And the city council, which was made up of proud Genevan citizens, pushed back hard against these two French refugees trying to dictate their lives.
Naturally.
And the mechanism that finally breaks everything apart is an argument over communion bread.
Of all things, yeah.
Geneva was allied with the more powerful city of Bern, and Bern demanded a uniform church ceremony across its allied cities. And that meant using unleavened bread for communion.
But Calvin and Farel refused to comply until a wider synod could decide the matter.
So the city council explicitly orders them to use the unleavened bread for the upcoming Easter service.
And Calvin and Farel not only refused to use the bread, they refused to administer communion entirely.
Which sparks a literal riot in the church.
Yes. Swords are actually drawn, and the very next day, the city council officially banishes them from Geneva.
Kicked out, exiled for a second time. So Calvin finally makes his way to Strasbourg, which is where he wanted to be all along.
Right, his original destination.
Yeah, he takes up a post as a minister, preaching to a congregation of a few hundred French refugees. He lives a quiet life. He vastly expands the institutes, and his friends start pressuring him to get married.
A prospect he viewed with intense, almost comical pragmatism.
Seriously. He writes a letter essentially saying, I'm not one of those foolish lovers who is smitten by a beautiful face. If I take a wife, it's so she can take care of my everyday worries and free me up to work.
It's so unromantic.
It is. He even had a failed engagement where he later admitted he wouldn't marry the woman unless the Lord had entirely bereft him of his wits.
But despite that unromantic start, he does marry Idelette de Bure, a widow in his congregation, in 1540.
Okay.
And by all historical accounts, it actually became a deeply affectionate and supportive partnership, though it was marked by tragedy.
Right.
They lost their only child together in infancy, and Idelette herself died just a few years later.
While Calvin is experiencing this brief window of peace in Strasbourg, Geneva is completely falling apart without him.
Total chaos.
Church attendance plummets, the political factions are at each other's throats, and the Catholic Church spots an opportunity.
A prominent Catholic cardinal named Sadoleto writes a brilliantly persuasive letter to the Genevan citizens, inviting them to abandon this chaotic reformation and return to the Mother Church.
Yeah, the Genevan City Council panics.
They really do. They realize no one left in the city has the theological intellect to debate the cardinal. They desperately need a response.
So they are forced to swallow their pride and reach out to the very man they had chased out of town with swords, John Calvin.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. They essentially fired their brilliant, difficult founder, watched the whole operation tank, and had to grovel to get him back. It's like a startup board begging a fired CEO to return and save the company.
That's exactly what it's like.
But what leverage did Geneva actually have? Calvin had the life he always wanted in Strasbourg.
They had absolutely no leverage except his conscience. Calvin initially writes a devastatingly brilliant response to the cardinal, defending Geneva's reforms. The response is a masterpiece, and the Geneva Council reads it and practically begs him to return permanently.
And Calvin's reaction to the invitation is visceral. He writes that he would rather submit to death 100 times than to that cross on which I had to perish daily 1,000 times over.
He physically recoils at the thought of going back to the chaos of Geneva.
But duty wins out over personal comfort. He believed God was calling him to shepherd that city. So with immense reluctance, he returns in 1541.
And he comes back and begins an absolute grind of a daily routine that essentially wires the city's spiritual life.
Yeah, we are talking about a man who preached over 2,000 sermons during his time in Geneva. And these were not quick 15-minute pep talks. They were dense, hour-long theological lectures.
And he never used notes.
Wait, really?
Never. He would simply walk to the pulpit, open the Bible, and systematically explain the text day after day, year after year.
It was such a fire hose of information that a professional scribe actually had to invent a specific shorthand system just to record what Calvin was saying in real time.
Which is incredible.
But to understand the friction that eventually tears his city apart, we have to look at the theology he was preaching.
Right. If we look at the expanded institutes, which grew from 6 chapters to 80 chapters, the core engine of Calvin's thought is the absolute unyielding sovereignty of God.
Good.
Calvin argued that humanity is totally depraved. Left to our own devices, our minds and hearts are corrupted. We are, as he said, perpetual idol factories. Therefore, we are completely incapable of choosing God or earning our own salvation.
So if humanity is totally incapable of choosing God, but some people are clearly saved, the logical conclusion is that God must be doing the choosing. Which brings us to the concept of double predestination.
Yes. And Calvin didn't invent predestination. It traces back through Augustine and the Apostle Paul, but he systematized it to its absolute logical extreme.
Explain that.
He argued that before time began, God actively chose some people for salvation and actively preordained others to eternal damnation.
Wow. That is a staggering concept. I mean, if God preordains everything, doesn't that make human effort completely pointless?
Yeah.
Doesn't it make God the author of evil?
Calvin recognized how difficult this was. He explicitly called it a dreadful or horrible decree.
Yeah.
But his legal, systematic mind couldn't escape the logic. If God is truly sovereign and all-powerful, nothing can happen outside of his will.
Right. Maintaining that strict neutrality here, it's fascinating to see how he built this historical argument.
Exactly. For Calvin, the point of this doctrine wasn't to induce terror, but to induce gratitude. If you are saved, it has absolutely nothing to do with your merit. It is purely an unmerited gift from a sovereign God.
But if you take a theology that says human actions contribute nothing to salvation, and you apply it to a city full of wealthy, powerful elites, you generate massive psychological friction.
Oh, massive.
If their actions don't save them, why should they obey Calvin's incredibly strict moral laws?
Right, and this friction births his greatest enemies, a group of elite, interrelated Genevan families that Calvin called the libertines.
and the libertines hated the new rules. Calvin had established the Consistory, which was a church court designed to enforce moral discipline.
And suddenly, these wealthy families were being called before the ministers and disciplined for dancing, for gambling, for wearing clothes that were too opulent, or for naming their children after Catholic saints.
They felt they had thrown off the tyranny of the Catholic Pope only to be subjugated by a French refugee.
Exactly. So they systematically harassed Calvin. They would loudly insult him in the streets, disrupt his sermons, and actively work to seize control of the civil government, the city council, to undermine his church court.
And by 1553, the libertines actually control the city council. Calvin's authority is hanging by a thread. He fully expects to be exiled again.
But right at this breaking point, a man named Michael Servetus mysteriously arrives in Geneva.
Yeah, Servetus is one of the most fascinating figures of the 16th century. He was a Spanish polymath, an incredibly brilliant physician who actually mapped the pulmonary circulation of the blood long before anyone else in Europe,
But he was also a radical theologian who denied the Christian doctrine of the Trinity.
which made him a universally hunted man. Catholics and Protestants across Europe considered him a dangerous, blasphemous heretic.
Furthermore, he had been privately trolling Calvin for years.
Literally trolling it.
Yes, he would send Calvin copies of the Institutes filled with insulting annotations, basically calling Calvin an idiot.
And Calvin was so enraged that he confided in a friend that if Servetus ever came to Geneva, he would not let him leave alive.
So Servetus escapes the Catholic Inquisition, who end up burning him in effigy because they couldn't find him.
Right.
And for some unfathomable reason, he stops in Geneva and attends one of Calvin's sermons. He is recognized, and Calvin demands his arrest.
Now, wait a second. If Calvin explicitly separated the church court from the civil court, like he believed the church only had spiritual power, like excommunication, how does a pastor with no civil authority end up putting a Spanish scientist on trial for his life?
That is the crucial mechanism here. Calvin didn't have the power to execute anyone.
Okay.
The trial of Servetus was entirely handled by the civil court, the city council. And ironically, the city council was controlled by the libertines, Calvin's bitter enemies.
So why didn't the libertines just let Servetus go to spite Calvin?
Because it was a geopolitical trap. The libertines let the trial drag on to humiliate Calvin, but Servetus was such a notorious heretic that the Genevan Council decided to ask the other major Protestant Swiss cities, Zurich, Bern, Basel, for their opinion on what to do.
And the libertines assumed the other cities would side against Calvin.
Exactly. Instead, every single city wrote back, urging Geneva to eliminate the heretic.
Wow. So the libertines played themselves. If they let Servetus go, Geneva would be a pariah among the Swiss alliance.
Precisely. They were forced by international pressure to sentence Servetus to burn at the stake.
And the sources note that Calvin, still acting as the theological prosecutor, actually asked the council to behead Servetus rather than burn him, arguing it was a more merciful death.
But the council, asserting their dominance, denied the request. Servetus burned.
And that brutal event fundamentally shifts the balance of power. Internationally, Calvin is suddenly viewed as the staunch defender of Orthodox Christianity.
And the libertines lose all their credibility. 2 years later, in 1555, they stage a drunken, poorly planned uprising against the French refugees who supported Calvin.
And the riot fails completely. The libertine leaders either flee the city or are executed by the civil government.
And just like that, the opposition is gone. For the last 9 years of his life, Calvin has undisputed influence in Geneva.
And he uses that time to build an engine for his legacy.
He really does. He founds the Geneva Academy, which eventually becomes the University of Geneva. He brings in top-tier scholars, and it becomes a massive intellectual hub.
But he doesn't just build an ivory tower. He builds an underground network. He trains and sends over 100 covert missionaries back into France.
Right. He gives them the theology, the liturgy, and the organizational structure they need to build a resilient Protestant movement under the nose of a hostile king.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is how Calvinism goes global.
Absolutely. Refugees from all over Europe fled to Geneva to escape persecution. John Knox fled from Queen Mary in England, spent time in Geneva, and then took Calvin's exact blueprint for church structure back to Scotland, giving birth to Presbyterianism.
And the English Puritans absorbed his theology and eventually carried it across the Atlantic to North America.
And the impact wasn't just theological, it literally rewired the economy.
This is perhaps his most surprising legacy. The sociologist Max Weber famously theorized that Calvin's theology provided the psychological starting point for modern capitalism.
Yes.
Let's unpack the mechanism of that.
Yeah.
How does a theology that says human effort is completely useless for salvation suddenly turn into capitalism?
It comes down to the psychological anxiety of predestination.
Okay.
If you cannot earn your salvation through good works, how do you know if you are one of God's chosen? The anxiety was crushing.
Right.
So later generations of Calvinists began looking for earthly signs of God's favor. Calvin taught that all honest work was a holy calling, a way to glorify God.
And later followers took this a step further. If you work incredibly hard, live a disciplined, sober life, and your business prospers, that earthly wealth must be a visible sign that God's grace is upon you.
So they took the Catholic guilt completely out of making money.
Yeah. Making money, as long as you reinvested it rather than wasting it on luxury, became an indicator of personal virtue.
Exactly. The Protestant work ethic. Hard work and economic success were no longer just practical goals, they were spiritual imperatives. It created an entire culture that viewed productivity as morality.
It's astounding. But the grind that built this system eventually caught up with him. By 1558, Calvin is severely ill.
Despite coughing up blood and suffering from a litany of diseases, he forces himself to finish the massive, definitive, final edition of the Institutes.
He strains his voice, continuing to preach until he bursts a blood vessel in his lungs. He slowly declines until his death in 1564, at the age of 54.
And bringing us back to the contradiction we started with, he insisted on an unmarked grave.
After spending his entire life watching the Catholic Church venerate saints and relics, he was terrified that the people of Geneva would turn his burial site into a shrine.
He wanted the focus to remain absolutely on the sovereignty of God, not on the human being who organized the theology. He built a system designed to outlast him, and he removed himself from the equation at the very end.
To this day, no one knows exactly where his body lies in that Genevan cemetery. It is the ultimate mic drop for a man who spent his life insisting that the human heart was a perpetual idol factory.
It really is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about the invisible architecture of your own life. You might not know the first thing about John Calvin's specific theology of double predestination. You might have never heard of the Institutes.
Probably not.
But tomorrow, when you feel a sudden pang of guilt because you weren't productive enough today, or if you ever catch yourself viewing someone's financial success as a reflection of their personal virtue, ask yourself, are you actually just living in the shadow of a 16th century fugitive preacher who refused to let you know where he was buried?
The ideas really do outlive the man.
They really do. Thank you for joining us for this journey. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the textbook summaries, and we will see you on the next deep dive.